German soldiers, one boom, then 1,000 shells exploded before they could move. Part 1. The silence before the shattering. In the winter of 1944, a German veteran sitting in a concrete bunker on the Siegfried Line felt a strange sense of confidence. He had survived the Russian winter. He had faced the British at Dunkirk. He believed that as long as he stayed in his deep, reinforced trench, he was safe. He looked across the no-man's land toward the American lines. He saw nothing. No tanks were moving. No infantry were charging. The sky was gray and silent. But miles behind those hills, hidden in the mud and the trees, were hundreds of American 105mm and 155mm howitzers. Their crews weren't loading shells yet. They were waiting. They were holding slide rules and maps. They were doing something the Germans had never seen before. They were synchronizing their watches. The German soldier reached for a cigarette, thinking he had time. He heard a single distant boom, a spotting round, he thought. He started to move toward the back of his trench. He never made it. Before the sound of that first shot had even faded, the entire horizon turned into a wall of fire. 1,000 shells hit his position at the exact same microsecond. This wasn't a bombardment. It was an execution. This was time on target, the math of the massacre. To understand why the Germans feared American artillery more than anything else, you have to understand the time on target tactic. In a traditional bombardment, one battery fires, then another, then another. This gives the enemy soldier time. He hears the first shells landing, and he has 5 to 10 seconds to dive into a hole or get under a tank. But the Americans realize that the first 5 seconds of an artillery strike are the most lethal. That is when the enemy is standing up, moving, or exposed. American mathematicians developed a system where different batteries, located at different distances from the target, would fire at different times. A battery 5 miles away would fire first. A battery 3 miles away would wait 20 seconds, then fire. A battery 1 mile away would wait 40 seconds, then fire. The result? All those shells traveling through the air at different speeds and from different angles would land on the exact same coordinate at the exact same second. The finger of God. The Germans began to describe American artillery as the finger of God. In the Hurtgen Forest and during the Battle of the Bulge, German officers reported that their units were being erased before they could even report they were under attack. There was no walk-up of fire. There was no warning. One moment, a German company was moving through a clearing. The next moment, the clearing didn't exist. The steel rain was so dense and so perfectly timed that it created a vacuum of air, collapsing lungs and shattering eardrums before the shrapnel even arrived. The American advantage, the radio, the secret to this instant death, wasn't just the guns, it was the communication. The United States entered the war with more radios and more telephone wire than any other army in history. Every American forward observer was a god of war. A single lieutenant with a radio could call back to a central fire direction center. Within minutes, that one lieutenant could command the fire of 300 guns. He didn't just ask for help. He typed in a coordinate and said, "Time on target, 0900 hours." At exactly 9 o'clock, the world would explode. The Germans, who relied on much slower communication systems, couldn't believe the speed. They thought the Americans had developed automatic cannons that could fire 1,000 rounds a minute. They couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that it was just thousands of men working together with the precision of a Swiss watch. The sound of the drum. German survivors of these strikes often suffered from a new kind of shell shock. They described the sound not as individual explosions, but as a drum roll, a continuous vibrating roar that felt like it was tearing the earth apart. They learned that against the Americans, there was no such thing as cover. If an American spotter saw you, you were already dead. You just didn't know it yet. As we continue this series, we will look at the specific battles where this tactic broke the back of the Third Reich, and the stories of the Redlegs, The American artilleryman who turned math into the most terrifying weapon of World War II. The king of battle had arrived. And it didn't miss. Part 2. The Eyes in the Sky. In the summer of 1944, a German Oberleutnant moving his company through the thick hedgerows of Normandy had a specific set of rules for survival. Keep the men spread out. Stay under the trees. Watch for the Allied Jabos, the fighter bombers. But there was one sound that made the veteran German soldiers freeze in their tracks. It wasn't the scream of a Mustang or the thunder of a thunderbolt. It was a low-powered, buzzing hum, the sound of a two-seat, fabric-covered Piper Cub, known to the Americans as the Grasshopper. To a civilian, it looked like a harmless recreational toy. To a German soldier, it was the messenger of the grave. Whenever that tiny, slow-moving plane appeared on the horizon, the German army stopped moving. They didn't fire their rifles. They didn't even light cigarettes. They knew that the man inside that plane wasn't carrying bombs. He was carrying something much worse. He was carrying a radio. And that radio was directly connected to 300 heavy cannons waiting just a few miles away. The flying telephone booth, the L-4 Grasshopper, was arguably the most dangerous aircraft of the entire war. It had no armor. It had no guns. It was so slow that a strong headwind could practically make it fly backward. But it was the eye of the needle for American artillery. Inside the cramped cockpit sat a pilot and an observer. Their job was simple: find the enemy. Because the plane was so slow and maneuverable, the pilot could hover over a German position at just 60 miles per hour, looking down directly into their trenches. The Germans called them Feuermelder, fire alarms. They knew that if the man in the plane saw a glint of a helmet or the smoke from a field kitchen, the time on target math was already starting. The grid map of doom. The pilot didn't need to be a genius. He just needed to be a mathematician. Every pilot carried a gridded map of the battlefield. When he spotted a target, perhaps a hidden German Panther tank or a column of infantry, he didn't just report a tank. He gave a precise coordinate, grid square 4729er. He would pick up his microphone and call back to the fire direction center. This is Red 1. I have a target of opportunity. 1 battery, 1 round, smoke. Over. Miles away, a single American howitzer would roar. Sound of a single echoing boom, followed by a long, whistling sound. A few seconds later, a single white puff of smoke would bloom near the German position. This was the spotting round. To the Germans on the ground, that white smoke was a death sentence. It was the one boom that signaled the end of the world. The pilot would watch the smoke drift. If it was a little off, he would say, drop 50, left 20. Fire for effect. The 1,000-shell response. This was the moment of the great American hammer. Once the pilot confirmed the spotting round was accurate, he would call for the time on target. The fire direction center would synchronize dozens of batteries. The orders went out over the radio. In less than 60 seconds, the single buzzing of the Grasshopper's engine would be drowned out by the sound of 1,000 shells screaming through the air at once. The German company below wouldn't even have time to scream. Because the Grasshopper was watching from above, the Americans could adjust the fire in real time. If the Germans tried to run to a nearby village, the pilot simply told the artillery where they were going. The fire would walk across the landscape, chasing the Germans until there was nothing left to chase. Grasshopper fever. The psychological impact was so severe that the German High Command issued an order. Any soldier who fires at a Grasshopper with a rifle will be court-martialed. Why? Because firing a rifle revealed your position. If you missed the tiny plane, which was very easy to do, the pilot would see the muzzle flash. 5 minutes later, your entire squad would be erased by heavy artillery. The sight of a Grasshopper created a state of paralysis. German tanks would sit motionless under camouflage nets for days, their crews afraid to even start the engines, simply because they saw a tiny yellow plane circling 3,000 feet above. The Americans had achieved total information dominance. They didn't need to see the enemy with their own eyes from the ground. They had the eyes in the sky to do it for them. The unsung heroes, the pilots of the L-4 Grasshoppers, were some of the bravest men in the military. They flew unarmed, slow, and low over the most dangerous battlefields in history. They were constantly targeted by German flak and occasionally hunted by Messerschmitt fighters. But they never stopped. They knew that as long as they were in the air, the king of battle was in control. They were the ones who turned the one boom into a 1,000-shell symphony of destruction. By the time the war reached the German border, the Grasshoppers had directed more fire and caused more casualties than any other unit in the United States Army. They were the reason the Germans stopped believing in their own fortifications. Because no matter how deep the trench or how thick the concrete, the eyes in the sky could see you, and Madusi's big brothers were only a radio call away. Part 3. The Ardennes Trap. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest was a graveyard of white and gray. A massive German counteroffensive, known as the Watch on the Rhine, had just slammed into a thin line of exhausted American troops. The Germans had a secret ally: the weather. A thick, impenetrable fog had settled over the forest, grounding the entire Allied Air Force. The feared Jabos, the American fighter bombers, were stuck on the runways. To the German commanders, this was the perfect opportunity. They believed that without their eyes in the sky, the American army was a blind giant. They were wrong. Because while the pilots were grounded, the Redlegs, the American artillerymen, were digging in their heels. They didn't need to see the sun to find their targets. They had their maps, they had their slide rules, and they were about to introduce the German army to a new kind of hell. The stand at Elsenborn Ridge, in the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the German 6th Panzer Army, Hitler's most elite force, hit a roadblock called Elsenborn Ridge. The German plan required a lightning-fast breakthrough, but they ran headfirst into a wall of American steel. The American infantry were outnumbered 10-1, but they had a direct line to the big guns. On that single ridge, the Americans massed nearly 350 cannons. When the German panzers and infantry emerged from the tree line, they didn't face a disorganized defense. They faced a coordinated time-on-target strike that felt like the world was ending. The German veterans reported that the fire was so intense, the snow didn't just melt, it evaporated. The earth turned into a boiling soup of mud and blood. The 6th Panzer Army, the pride of the Third Reich, was stopped cold. Not by tanks, but by the mathematical precision of the American artillery batteries. The secret of the VT fuse. It was during the Battle of the Bulge that the Americans unleashed their most guarded secret of the war: the variable time, or VT fuse. Before this, artillery shells usually exploded when they hit the ground. If a shell landed in deep snow, the explosion was muffled, and the shrapnel stayed buried in the mud. But the VT fuse was a miracle of engineering. It contained a tiny rugged radar set inside the nose of the shell. As the shell screamed toward the ground, the radar would feel the earth. When it was exactly 30 feet above the surface, it would trigger the explosion. This was the ultimate nightmare for the German infantry. There was no hiding in a trench anymore. The VT shells exploded in the air, raining millions of jagged steel fragments straight down into the holes where the Germans were hiding. General George Patton called it the most important development in the history of warfare. At the Bulge, the VT fuse turned the Ardennes forest into a giant vertical meat grinder. The donut of fire, Bastogne. While the battle raged on the ridges, the town of Bastogne was completely surrounded. The 101st Airborne was trapped, freezing, and running out of food. The Germans sent a message demanding surrender. The American response was nuts. But bravery alone doesn't stop a panzer division. The reason the Screaming Eagles survived Bastogne was the artillery. Hidden in the center of the town, in a small circle known as the Donut, were several batteries of 105mm howitzers. Because the Americans were surrounded, they could fire in 360 degrees. Whenever the Germans tried to probe the American lines, the paratroopers would pick up their radios. Fire mission, target, the edge of the woods. Within seconds, the guns in the center of the town would roar. Because they were using time-on-target math, the shells would land at the exact moment the German tanks emerged from the trees. The Germans couldn't understand how the Americans, who were supposedly trapped and low on ammo, could still summon 1,000 shells at a moment's notice. The sound of survival for the American infantryman shivering in his foxhole. The sound of his own artillery was the most beautiful music in the world. It was the one boom, followed by the 1,000 shells that reminded him he wasn't alone. By the time the fog finally cleared and the planes could fly again, the German offensive had already been broken. It had been shattered against a wall of artillery fire that never slept and never missed. The king of battle had held the line when everything else had failed. The math of the American artillery officers had proven more powerful than all of Hitler's panzers combined. The Ardennes was no longer a path to victory for the Germans. It was a mass grave made of steel and ice. The end of the Blitzkrieg, the Battle of the Bulge, was the last time the German army would ever attempt a major offensive. Their spirit was broken by the realization that even with the advantage of surprise, weather, and numbers, they could not overcome the American system of fire. The one boom, 1,000 shells tactic wasn't just a way to kill soldiers. It was a way to paralyze an entire empire. And as the Americans began their final march into Germany, the guns were already being reloaded for the next coordinate. Part 4. The Final Embrace. By the spring of 1945, the German army was a wounded animal backed into a corner. They had retreated behind the Siegfried Line, a jagged teeth-like row of concrete dragon's teeth and thousands of reinforced bunkers. The German propaganda called it the West Wall. They told their soldiers that no army on earth could break through these miles of steel and stone. But the Americans didn't plan on breaking through the wall. They planned on erasing it. The Redlegs had reached their peak efficiency. They had perfected the math. They had mastered the time on target, and now they had more ammunition than the world had ever seen. The Germans were about to find out that concrete is just another form of dust when it meets 10,000 tons of American high explosives. The sniper with a 15-ton rifle, as the Americans approached the massive bunkers of the Siegfried Line, they encountered a problem. Indirect fire shells falling from the sky sometimes bounced off the thick rounded roofs of the German pillboxes. The American solution was as bold as it was terrifying: direct fire. They took their massive 155mm howitzers, nicknamed Long Toms, and drove them right up to the front lines. These were guns that were designed to hit targets 15 miles away. Now American crews were aiming them at targets just 500 yards away. Inside the German bunkers, the soldiers looked through their narrow viewing slits and saw a nightmare. They saw the giant black muzzles of American heavy artillery pointing directly at their faces. Sound of a massive close-range explosion followed by the sound of crumbling stone. One boom. The shell, traveling at supersonic speeds, didn't arc through the air. It flew in a flat, straight line. It would hit the bunker's steel door or its viewing slit with the force of a falling mountain. One shot would turn a 3-foot-thick concrete wall into a pile of gravel. It wasn't a battle. It was industrial demolition performed under fire. The Ruhr Pocket, the ultimate tot. In April of 1945, the Americans performed their greatest tactical masterpiece, the encirclement of the Ruhr Valley. They trapped over 300,000 German soldiers in a giant pocket. The German commanders thought they could hold out for months. But the Americans didn't want to send their infantry into the ruins of the industrial cities. Instead, they surrounded the pocket with nearly 1,000 pieces of artillery. This was the ultimate time-on-target demonstration. The American Fire Direction Centers coordinated every gun from 4 different divisions. A German soldier in the center of the pocket would hear a single solitary boom from a lone spotting gun. He would have exactly 4 seconds to wonder what it meant. Then the sky would turn black. Because the Americans had so many guns, they could sustain a drum fire for hours. It wasn't just 1,000 shells in 1 second. It was 1,000 shells every minute, for 60 minutes. The psychological collapse was total. German officers reported that their men weren't just surrendering. They were walking toward the American lines in a trance, their eardrums burst and their minds broken by the constant hammer. By the time the Ruhr pocket surrendered, 317,000 Germans had laid down their arms. The artillery had won the battle before the infantry even fixed their bayonets. The logistics of death, the reason the Americans could fire this much was the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks worked 24 hours a day to bring steel rain to the front. In 1945, the United States was producing shells faster than the Germans could dig holes to hide in. At the peak of the Rhine crossing, American artillery was firing over 15,000 tons of shells every 24 hours. To the German soldier, who was lucky to have 5 bullets for his rifle, the American abundance was the ultimate proof that the war was over. They weren't just being outfought. They were being outmanufactured. The one boom they heard was the sound of a Detroit factory line reaching across the ocean to strike them down. The crossing of the Rhine. When the time came to cross the Rhine River, the final natural barrier to the heart of Germany, the artillery provided the final embrace. As the boats hit the water, the American guns created a creeping barrage. A wall of explosions moved exactly 100 yards in front of the American soldiers. It was so precise that the infantry could practically lean against the curtain of fire. The Germans on the other side of the river couldn't even raise their heads to fire their machine guns. The moment they tried, time-on-target strike would land on their coordinates. The American artillery had created a safe corridor made of fire and steel. The King's final bow. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May of 1945, the guns finally went silent. The Redlegs, the men who had spent years calculating angles, wind speeds, and powder charges, finally stepped away from their howitzers. They had earned their title as the King of Battle. They had proven that in modern war, the side with the best math and the most shells wins. They had taken the one boom of a single spotting round and turned it into the 1,000-shell signature of American victory. The Siegfried Line was in ruins. The Ruhr was silent. The Rhine had been crossed. And it was all because when the American artillery said time on target, the target had no choice but to disappear. The story of the American artillery wasn't just about power. It was about the incredible synchronization of thousands of men working as one single devastating machine. It was the automatic drum fire that signaled the end of an empire. Part 5, The Typhoon of Steel, in May of 1945. While the world was celebrating the end of the war in Europe, a different kind of hell was unfolding on a small rocky island in the Pacific. The island was Okinawa. The Japanese defenders had spent years digging into the limestone ridges, creating an underground honeycomb of caves and tunnels that were immune to standard bombing. They didn't have the Tiger tanks of the Germans, but they had something just as dangerous, the Shuri Line. The American infantry found themselves trapped in a vertical war. Every time they tried to climb a ridge, they were met with a wall of machine gun fire. But behind them, sitting on the beaches and the decks of ships, was the Great Hammer. On Okinawa, the United States Army and Marines unleashed the greatest concentration of artillery fire in the history of the Pacific War. The survivors called it the Typhoon of Steel. The cave hunter, the time-on-target tactic, had to be adapted for the Pacific. In Europe, the targets were usually in the open or in buildings. On Okinawa, the targets were hidden deep inside the earth. The American artillerymen became cave hunters. They used their 155mm howitzers to perform a deadly dance. First, a single spotting round, the one boom, would hit the entrance of a cave. Then, instead of just a simultaneous explosion, the Americans would coordinate a suppression wave. They would fire a time-on-target strike to force the Japanese soldiers deep into the back of the cave. Then, while the dust was still settling, the American infantry would rush the entrance. It was a perfect symphony of fire and movement. The artillery wasn't just killing the enemy. It was pinning them down, trapping them in their own tunnels so the flamethrower teams could finish the job. The Korean shift. The human wave fast-forward 5 years to 1950. The world had changed, but the math of the Redlegs had only gotten sharper. In the frozen mountains of Korea, the American artillery faced its most terrifying test, the human wave attacks of the Chinese people as volunteer army. In the middle of the night, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers would charge across the valleys, blown forward by the sound of bugles and whistles. They were moving too fast for traditional air support. The only thing standing between the thin American lines and total annihilation was the one boom. An American forward observer, shivering in a foxhole at 30 degrees below zero, would see the massive wave of soldiers approaching through his starlight scope. He would pick up his radio and whisper a single word: fire. Sound of a massive, rolling thunder that sounds like a continuous drumbeat. Van Fleet Day. During the Battle of the Iron Triangle, the Americans unleashed what became known as the Van Fleet Day. General James Van Fleet ordered his artillery to fire without restriction. In a single 24-hour period, the American batteries fired over 100,000 rounds. This was time on target on a massive scale. Because the enemy was attacking in such high numbers, the Americans didn't just hit one coordinate, they used box barrages. They would create a square of fire, 1,000 shells landing simultaneously on the front, the back, and the sides of the enemy formation. The Chinese soldiers found themselves trapped inside a box of death. Every time they tried to move forward, 1,000 shells exploded. Every time they tried to retreat, another 1,000 shells exploded behind them. The survivors of these attacks spoke of the sound of the sky tearing. They realized that no matter how many men they sent, they could not outrun the American math. From slide rules to digital brains, as the Korean War ground into a stalemate, the one boom, 1,000 shells tactic underwent its final transformation. The American military began to replace the hand-drawn maps and wooden slide rules with the first generation of electronic computers. The Fire Direction Center was becoming a digital brain. They could now account for the rotation of the Earth, the temperature of the gunpowder, and the exact wind speed at 10,000 feet in just seconds. The one-boom spotting round was becoming a relic. The math was becoming so accurate that the first shell was often a direct hit. The Americans were moving toward first-round fire for effect. This meant that the enemy would never even hear the warning shot. They would only hear the 1,000 shells arriving at once. The legacy of the Redlegs, the story of American artillery, is the story of the Invisibles. These were men who fought battles they could not see, against enemies they would never meet, using math they had learned in high schools across the United States. They turned the one boom into a psychological weapon. They taught the world that on the modern battlefield, there's no such thing as too far away. If you are on the map, you are in the crosshairs. The Siegfried Line, the Ruhr Pocket, the Shuri Line, and the Iron Triangle, all of them fell not because of a single heroic charge, but because of the steady, relentless ticking of a watch and the thunder of 1,000 guns firing as one. The king of battle never abdicated his throne. Even today, in the age of drones and satellites, the doctrine of time on target remains the gold standard of warfare. It is the reminder that in the face of American firepower, the only safe place to be is somewhere else. The one boom is still out there waiting, and the 1,000 shells are never far behind. Part 6. The Calculus of Victory. The war in Europe and the Pacific didn't just end because of one bullet or one bomb. It ended because of a system. A system that could take a single coordinate on a map and turn it into a scorched earth in under 3 minutes. Throughout this series, we have seen the one boom of the spotting round and the 1,000 shells that followed. But as the smoke cleared from the battlefields of Germany, Korea, and Vietnam, a question remained. How did the Americans do it? How did a nation of farmers, clerks, and factory workers become the most lethal mathematicians in the history of warfare? The answer wasn't found in the barrel of the gun. It was found in the Fire Direction Center, the hidden brain of the American artillery. This is the story of the legacy of the Redlegs and why, even today, the world still trembles when the king of battle clears his throat. The brain behind the brawn. To the German or Japanese soldier, the time-on-target strike felt like magic or a miracle of technology. But to the men in the American Fire Direction Center, or FDC, it was pure cold math. Inside the FDC, often just a tent or a wooden hut a few miles behind the lines, sat the slide rule warriors. While the infantry fought with bayonets, these men fought with pencils. They had to account for variables that would make a college professor dizzy. They calculated the air temperature, the humidity, the wear on the inside of the gun barrel, and even the rotation of the earth itself. If their math was off by even 0.1%, the 1,000 shells would land on their own men. But they were almost never off. They were the ones who took the one boom and synchronized the watches of 300 guns across a 20-mile front. They were the reason that 1,000 shells, fired at different times from different places, arrived at the exact same heartbeat. The psychological ghost, the legacy of American artillery, isn't just recorded in casualty counts. It is recorded in the psychological scars of those who survived it. German veterans from the Western Front spoke of artillery fever, a state of permanent shell shock where the sound of any distant door slamming or a car backfiring would send men diving into the mud. They didn't fear the American tanks as much as they feared the silence. Because in the silence, they knew the eyes in the sky were watching. They knew that the one boom was always coming. This psychological dominance changed the way wars were fought. Commanders stopped thinking about how to beat American artillery and started thinking about how to avoid it. But as the Americans moved into the digital age, avoiding it became impossible. From the Ruhr to the desert, the evolution. The lessons of 1945 didn't stay in the history books. They evolved. During the Gulf War in 1991, the Iraqi army, the fourth largest in the world at the time, found out that the American time on target had gone digital. The Americans introduced the MLRS, the Multiple Launch Rocket System. The soldiers called it the Grid Square Removal Service. Using GPS and advanced computers, a single battery could now achieve the same effect as 1,000 shells from World War II, but with even more terrifying speed. The one boom was no longer a smoke shell. It was a satellite signal. And the 1,000 shells were now guided rockets that could strike with the precision of a surgeon. The doctrine remained the same: massed fire, perfect synchronization, and total annihilation of the target before they could even move. The final salute to the Redlegs, the men who wear the red stripe on their uniforms, the artillerymen known as Redlegs, carry a heavy burden. They are the ones who provide the steel rain that protects the infantry. They are the ones who ensure that when an American soldier is in trouble, the entire weight of the United States military can be brought down on a single point on a map. As we close this series, we remember the crews of the Long Toms, the pilots of the Grasshoppers, and the mathematicians of the FDC. They proved that the ultimate weapon isn't just a bigger gun. It is a smarter system. They took the chaos of the battlefield and organized it into a symphony of destruction. They are the king of battle. They are the one boom that warns of the storm and the 1,000 shells that ensure the storm never ends until the victory is won. The math is done. The watches are synchronized. And the king is still on his throne.